Although not entirely convincing, Ingo Swann's viewings of Kerguelen Island and the classified Virginia site are certainly intriguing and suggestive of something reality-bending. But up to this point, even Swann's most seemingly accurate moments of clairvoyance cannot escape the boogeyman of confirmation bias, as analysis of Swann's, or any remote viewer's, descriptions must be performed by an inevitably flawed third party. An airstrip next to a building is a sufficiently vague statement that anyone can fit to practically anywhere. What qualifies as an airstrip? Anything from a helipad to LaGuardia Airport could easily fit the bill. And what is a building? A disused Soviet-era outhouse or a large munitions factory would both qualify. Some combination could probably be linked to anywhere on Earth's surface touched by human habitation. And note that the term confirmation bias does not only apply to positive interpretations. A highly skeptical analyst might ignore less ambiguous statements because he or she doesn't believe in psychic abilities. A big white X is on the building might be ignored if the actual site had a large yellow Maltese cross painted on an adjoining wall. Such a situation would not be definitive, of course, but it should obviously not be ignored. Descriptive specificity and blind statistical analysis are the keys to reliable data regarding remote viewing. This fact was not lost to those at the SRI, nor the CIA, the primary sponsor of Project SCANATE, the research initiative created to test for the study, exploitation, and cultivation of psychic powers. By early 1970, about $210,000 was budgeted by the Office of Technical Services and the Office of Research and Development, both subdivisions of the CIA, for the SRI's SCANATE research. Having secured funding, and encouraged by Ingo Swann's apparent success, and what they likely perceived as somewhat of a vindication of their own scientific curiosity, SRI researchers Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ expanded the scope of their experiments. Other SCANATE volunteers would be sought, and two distinct groups would be formed out of those volunteers. Those who were self-described psychics, referred to as experienced, and willing participants who had shown little to no previous paranormal ability, referred to as learners. Aside from the decidedly experienced Ingo Swann, these included former Burbank, California Police Commissioner Pat Price, photographer Hella Hammond, social scientist Dwayne Elgin, SRI staff member Marshall Peace, and mathematician Phyllis Cole. The CIA cash infusion also included a budget for the testing and evaluation of famous self-described mystifier Uri Geller, although these tests were separate and apart from those focused solely on cartographic remote viewing and resembled those first administered to Ingo Swann, such as telekinetically affecting the operation of mechanisms, accurately guessing outcomes of randomly generated sequences, and locating items in hidden locations. On June 1, 1973, a Lake Tahoe area man named Pat Price telephoned to the offices at SRI to inquire about his chances to participate in psychic research. Although hesitant to accept volunteers out of the blue, Puthoff made an exception in Price's case, as they had been acquainted with each other several years before, both of them having dabbled in Scientology. Price had at one time served as police commissioner of Burbank, California. Quote, "In fact, as police commissioner, I used my abilities to track down suspects, although at the time I couldn't confront the fact that I had these abilities, and laid my good fortune to intuition and good luck." Unquote. During the introductory phone call, Puthoff gave Price the coordinates for the classified NSA site in Virginia, as given to him by the CIA contract monitor Kid Green, that was originally meant for Ingo Swann as a remote viewing target only days before. By Puthoff's own admission, this was an impulsive decision, but one that was eagerly agreed to by Price. 3 days later, Puthoff received a 5-page written response, detailing the target site in question from both an aerial and ground-level perspective. Supposedly, the descriptions were much more detailed than those that had been given by Swann, going so far as to list the nameplates on office desks and the contents of a locked filing cabinet. Although the unauthorized dissemination of coordinates to a classified site might seem reasonable cause for alarm, the bureaucratic faux pas went unmentioned, and Puthoff was informed several weeks later by a member of the CIA that Price's impromptu viewing was essentially correct, and that, like Swann, analysis had suggested Price could not have obtained the information by any ordinary means. Strangely, according to a CIA memorandum that detailed the specifics of the SCANATE contract and funding, Pat Price was the only one of those tested who was aware of any CIA involvement. This might indicate he had prior knowledge in relation to the Virginia target site, as he may have been employed as a member of the CIA or NSA at some point in the past. Also, one has to wonder how Price seemed to have somewhat detailed knowledge of the SRI's experiments, considering that almost up to the time of his telephone introduction, Pitof and Targ viewed their work as only a test of Ingo Swann's abilities, and that the undertaking of a more general, real-world series of remote viewing experiments was more or less Swann's idea alone. Perhaps Swann and Price had a common associate that facilitated communication between them before Price's phone call. Or perhaps Price and Swann knew each other personally, which seems a reasonable line of inquiry considering they both maintained similar esoteric interests. A senior social scientist at SRI, Dwayne Elgin worked primarily as a futurist, a person who, through observation and pattern recognition, predicts the evolution of society and technology to facilitate cultural progress. Despite his enthusiastic participation in remote viewing experiments and being branded experienced by Pitof and Targ, Elgin's own opinion of his seemingly psychic talents were somewhat more grounded than those of most non-skeptics. Quote, Dwayne credits much of his success to simply paying attention to subtle and delicate changes within his body awareness he feels are oftentimes among the most useful indicators of the occurrence of psychic functioning. Unquote. Although a more introverted perspective, this view is very similar to the idea of reading the subtle body language of others to determine desires or motivations, and probably has, perhaps to the chagrin of psi researchers such as Pitof and Targ, a great deal more to do with the propagation of psychic hits than one might first realize. Born in Frankfurt, Germany in July of 1921, Hella Hammad had moved to the United States as a teenager and eventually established a career as a professional photographer, specializing in candid portraits and commissioned studies for various literary projects, her work appearing in everything from Life magazine to the pages of the New York Times. Ms. Hammad had been friends with Russell Targ for over a decade and was quickly called upon by him as a viable candidate for the SCANATE program. Ms. Hammad was in fact considered a learner by those of the SRI, despite having some years before her involvement with SCANATE participated in studies of ESP. Unlike Ingo Swann and Pat Price, she professed no strong opinions on the matter, other than a general fascination with the subject of psychic powers, and did not openly claim to be in possession of such. In one preliminary test, referred to by Targ as a mock experiment, Ms. Hammad was escorted to the rooftop of the SRI's engineering building, apparently during a rain shower, and given a walkie-talkie to communicate remotely with Pitof, who had driven to an undisclosed location in the area, mentally focusing on a particular building. When asked to remotely view the building, Ms. Hammad's response was impressive, to say the least. Quote, I see a little house covered with red, overlapping boards. It has a white trim and a very tall, pointed roof. The building is empty, as though nothing is going on inside, and the whole thing seems artificial, like a movie set. Unquote. The building was in fact a 15-foot-tall replica of a schoolhouse at a local miniature golf course. While very interesting, Targ acknowledges that the use of a walkie-talkie and lack of third-party analysis greatly diminishes the quality of Ms. Hammad's guess, if only because of the blatant possibility of cueing, such as extemporaneous sounds at the target site, unintentional statements made by one of the researchers, etc. Considered learners, as neither had experience with psychic phenomena, SRI mathematician Phyllis Cole and computer scientist Marshall Peace volunteered to participate in SCANATE experiments in October of 1974, the objective of which, in their particular case, served a dual purpose: to see if laypersons could acquire psychic abilities, and to act as a baseline control with which to compare supposed genuine clairvoyance. To eliminate the possibility of a remote viewer using what was termed eidetic memory, essentially undisclosed foreknowledge of coordinates around the Earth's surface, a protocol of double-blind experiments was developed, a geographic survey as before, but this time specifically of locations around the San Francisco Bay Area, with no coordinates given before the attempted viewing. In this experiment, a target location and travel instructions were selected at random from a batch previously prepared by the director of the SRI's Information Science and Engineering Division. A group between 2 and 4 SRI researchers, known as the Demarcation Team, would then travel together by automobile to the selected location using the associated instructions. The demarcation team was given 30 minutes to arrive at the target site, and at no time communicated with anyone at SRI about their itinerary. The team would then remain at the target site for 30 minutes. This duration was shortened to 15 minutes later in the experiment. Meanwhile, a remote viewer and an observing researcher were sequestered at the SRI and told an experiment was underway. A viewer would wait 30 minutes, the allowed travel time for the demarcation team, and then relay his impressions about the target, both verbally and visually, using a sketchpad. Once the demarcation team returned to the institute, the viewer was taken to the site to allow him to personally compare his recorded notes. This was not used to determine the success or failure of the task, but as an ancillary attempt to determine if his or her abilities would improve with feedback. Following a number of such target locations, unlabeled individual packets containing transcripts of each recorded viewing session, accompanied by relevant drawings, were given to an independent, supposedly skeptical analyst in a random order. The analyst would then travel to each location and rank the accuracy of each packet from 1 to 9, a 1 denoting a high degree of accuracy, and a 9 denoting gross imprecision. A statistical model developed by UC Santa Barbara psychologist Robert Morris was then applied to the analyst's conclusions to calculate the accuracy of each viewing and see if any hits were better than what would be expected by chance. This calculation resulted in a p-value that fell within a range from 0 to 1, a 1 meaning the likelihood of the null hypothesis being true, that is, the hypothesis that nothing paranormal was going on, was 100%. Unsurprisingly, as he had been the sole focus of research up to this point, Ingo Swann was the initial subject of the more highly developed tighter protocol, although there appears to be some confusion on the matter. In their written recollection of the SRI experiments, Patoff and Targ are fairly clear Swann was first, yet within the analysis he is listed as Subject 3. Swann completed a total of 4 trials, focusing on a variety of remote target locations, one of the more interesting of which was the Palo Alto City Hall. During this particular session, Swann drew an annotated sketch to aid in geographic context, which was compared at a later time with a photograph. Among his notes and verbal statements, Swann indicates a number of buildings, at least one with columns and windows that were set in, a fountain, which seemed to make no sound, a small line of 4 trees, and an artistic design on some pavement. Many of Swann's visions seemed to coincide with reality. The City Hall campus is comprised of a small plaza surrounded by a number of buildings, the primary of which has a series of windows inset within the outer walls, which vaguely resembles a set of architectural columns. Within the plaza is a fountain, now converted into a raised planter, which at the time of the demarcation team's visit was not functioning, which would seem to explain its silence. On the southwestern side of the location, there is indeed a line of 4 trees, and the pavement covering the entire plaza is laid with a simple geometric design. This is all certainly striking, but Swann's guesses were not without error. Where he indicates an open field is a city street, and had been for several preceding decades. There is no wall or building immediately on the other side of the 4 trees. The area indicated by a question mark is, of course, meaningless, tantamount to saying, some stuff. Regardless, the statistical significance across all of Swann's viewings was calculated to have a p-value of 3.83 times 10 to the negative 4th, or about 0.000383. The probability of the null hypothesis being correct was therefore very low. Needless to say, it seems, at least on the surface, Ingo Swann was utilizing much more than simple luck. Former Burbank Police Commissioner Pat Price scored a p-value notably more impressive than Swann, achieving a high degree of accuracy for 7 of 9 targets. For most of his trials, Price was sequestered within a specially designed Faraday cage, built from copper screen. This was done to determine if electromagnetic shielding had a deleterious effect on remote viewing success. Considering the results, Patoff and Targ, as well as later CIA analysts, concluded the effect was negligible. 2 of the more interesting targets viewed by Price are the Hoover Tower on the Stanford University campus and the Redwood City Marina. Of the tower, Patoff notes, quote, "We heard a somewhat rambling description about a general view of the area, which became tighter and more coherent, until finally we heard, seems like it would be Hoover Tower." Unquote. For the marina, Price described a little boat dock along the bay, sailing ships with furled sails, oriental architecture, and a series of granite steps leading to the water's edge. all of which were accurate. Price's comments were so astounding, Puthoff even wondered if someone on the demarcation team was colluding with Price. This paranoia was also felt by one of the team members, Bonner Cox, who personally drove the team to the marina via a very serpentine manner in case there was something leaked about their travel orders. Of course, envisioning boats in the water while in a city adjacent to the San Francisco Bay hardly seems a stretch to begin with. With an ultimate p-value of 1.84 times 10 to the negative 6, Hella Hamid's performance proved the best of the group. Like Price, Hamid attempted to view 9 separate targets. However, considering her exceptional performance in preliminary tests, and the fact that viewers all seemed to become visibly exhausted about halfway into the process, the demarcation team normal location time of 30 minutes was reduced to 15. During the remote viewing of a pedestrian overpass, Hamid made a sketch and declared she saw a kind of trough up in the air. Reference photographs were taken sometime after the fact, inviting rather interesting comparisons, although one could argue the photographer conformed his pictures to a known expectation. Viewing another target site in Menlo Park, Hamid described an open barn-like structure, making light and dark bars on the wall. The target was an open-sided bicycle shed, the physical construction of which seems to have been described in detail. Like Swan, experiments with Dwayne Elgin involved 4 different sites, including a transit station, a tennis court, a golf course, and a specially shielded room at the SRI. Strangely, Elgin seemed to experience visions beyond that typically associated with clairvoyance or clairaudience, describing tactile sensations of the demarcation team as well. Quote, "I have the impression that Russell is feeling a smooth metal surface, sort of large plates, large metal plates, somewhat rectangular," unquote. At the time, Targ and the team were at a Bay Area rapid transit train station and were studying a route map posted to a wall. At 25 minutes after 11 a.m., Elgin quipped, "Everything changes. I don't see them anymore." This statement coincided with the team boarding an outbound train and leaving the area. During each of his trials, Elgin would hold out a compass at arm's length in an attempt to directionally locate the demarcation team. Puthoff notes he was always within 10 degrees of the correct answer, though since this was a peculiarity specific to Elgin and not a pre-planned portion of the test, it is possible the accuracy is somewhat overstated. At one point, Elgin claimed the team was at a museum that he was familiar with, though he composed a trio of sketches which did not seem to correspond to something with which he was aware. The team was, in fact, across adjoining Rinconada Park, wandering around a set of tennis courts, the actual target. Elgin's sketches do indeed seem to suggest something odd, though if he was familiar with the museum, one has to wonder if he was also familiar with the tennis courts, less than 200 meters away. Targ also notes Elgin seemed to have difficulty determining if the team was inside or outside a building during his tests. This could indicate some sort of environmental shielding against psychic imagery, or a subtle attempt by Elgin to fish for clues. Regardless, like Swan, Elgin received a p-value of about 3.8 times 10 to the negative 4, which is far below that of either Hamid or Price, but still far above what would be reasonably expected by random chance. Marshall Peace and Phyllis Cole each conducted remote viewings of 4 separate targets. As learners, that is, individuals with little sign of previous paranormal abilities, both Peace and Cole received similarly unremarkable results, and were both given a p-value of 0.08, a score considered statistically insignificant. Interestingly, one of Peace's targets was the same pedestrian overpass viewed by Hella Hamid, and one of Cole's targets duplicated one of Elgin's, an outdoor kiosk in Menlo Park. These targets received a score of 3 and 5 respectively. However, in viewing the target of a Dutch-style windmill, Peace produced an annotated drawing with some strikingly familiar features, though ultimately he claimed the spoked wheel shape to be an image on a wall. Conversely, when Cole was targeting a plaza on the Stanford University campus, she indicated a set of curvy benches surrounded by landscaping and greenery, which was indeed accurate. She even announced the site location by name to the experimental observer. Although there was little reason to believe any paranormal activity was afoot in either of the 2 subjects, the handful of oddly specific claims, when viewed within the context of low mathematical results, may speak more of experimental weaknesses than extraordinary mental powers. The experimental protocols designed by Puthoff and Targ do inject some credibility into the final results. The possibility of the inadvertent passing of information by researchers was considered at every step of the way, and considerable effort was put toward a consistently applied, mathematically centered analysis. However, it is important to realize that these protocols, as with all highly structured plans, were theoretical and represented how the experiment would play out in more or less perfect conditions, with everyone involved behaving in a very exacting way. What if a scheduled member of the demarcation team suddenly fell ill and was replaced by someone with less understanding of the need to be secretive? Was there any way to ensure test subjects were not already familiar with any of the test sites, other than their verbal assurance? Exactly how neutral were the attitudes of the data analysts? Somewhere during the recording and flow of information, at some point during the process involving numerous individuals, opinions about psychic phenomena would creep in and very likely color either what was recorded or what was interpreted. In CIA documentation detailing the experiments, certain highly questionable decisions are alluded to, such as consulting unbiased professionals as independent observers, and allowing, on several occasions, test subjects to act as part of the demarcation team. Phyllis Cole participated during tests of both Price and Elgin, and Hella Hamid during those of Marshall Peace. There was also some question as to the quality of the pool of targets used. All sites had to be within 30 minutes driving time, which would all but necessitate the need for the site to be near a street or paved road. In fact, out of at least 100 selected target sites, all but 7 were within just 4 miles of the SRI. Despite implications to the contrary, target sites were not randomly selected through some process akin to throwing a dart at a map of the Bay Area. All potential sites were in fact chosen by Harold Brown, SRI's Director of Information Science and Engineering, who must have been given some instructions by either Puthoff or Targ regarding essential selection criteria. This means that at least one person knew of the locations substantially ahead of time. Even assuming Director Brown was a completely disinterested and unbiased party, which is unlikely seeing as he was present during at least one remote viewing session, discernible patterns appearing among the selections is a distinct possibility. Pat Price was given a target in Rinconada Park, a swimming pool, as was Dwayne Elgin, a set of nearby tennis courts. Although it is unclear, Hella Hamid may have also been given a target in the same park, the bicycle shed. In fact, all target locations used fall within a distinct semicircle around the SRI facility. Remote viewers might communicate with each other in between sessions and deduce information from such patterns, perhaps even subconsciously. Furthermore, even if the preceding objections are ignored, Russell Targ himself notes a peculiarity which suggests another possible weakness. Quote, "It was repeatedly observed throughout the experiments that most of the correct information related to us by subjects was of a non-analytic nature pertaining to shape, form, color, and material rather than to function or name." Unquote. In other words, a majority of information obtained during remote viewing sessions amounted to descriptions of basic physical features, such as square, tall, red, green, soft, rough, wavy, etc. None of these bits of data really had to be analyzed, as they were simple and declarative. An analyst didn't have to mull over the statistical odds of whether something a viewer supposedly saw was round and blue. The target in question was either round and blue or it wasn't. Admittedly, in this case, it is possible said target was either round or blue, but one would only then have to separate each quality into a separate claim to reach the same conclusion. In most cases, such non-analytical statements are completely ambiguous and subjective. What's round? A basketball and a boomerang are both round, but are entirely different objects. What's blue? Cerulean and phthalocyanine are both considered blue, but are wildly unalike. Anyone who records these types of statements can very easily and unintentionally ascribe their own personal interpretation, which would result in great distortions. Statistically, some number of target sites will have artificial structures, and although notably fewer, some sites will have artificial structures that are of an unusual shape. Even what seems to be highly unlikely, highly specific descriptions become probable, if not inevitable, when enough guesses are made, as one must consider the quality of guesses and the very definition of specificity. At first glance, Hella Hamid's description of a trough up in the air and her subsequent drawing of a pedestrian overpass is somewhat compelling, but when considered more carefully, Hamid's drawing of the overpass is both deceptively simple and open-ended. SRI researchers would likely have given high marks to the same drawing if the target had been an electrical transmission tower, quite common in the San Francisco Bay Area. In this case, one could easily interpret the description of a trough to mean a trough for moving large amounts of electricity. It is also possible that remote viewing subjects were subconsciously reading cues from researchers. The most insignificant facial expression, the tiniest verbal whisker, the briefest pause in conversation, all might give subjects a clue as to the accuracy of their own statements and cause them to make adjustments that ultimately seemed to magically fit into objective reality. Seemingly miraculous mental feats have been performed throughout history using nothing more than close observation of physical cues, and such a skill isn't exclusively the domain of the highly intelligent or even the human mind in general. In a shockingly brief amount of time, dogs and cats will almost seem to perform feats of telepathy, picking up on minute movements and physical tics of their owners that their owners themselves aren't even aware of. A notable example of this phenomenon can be found in the tale of Clever Hans, a horse owned by teacher and amateur trainer Wilhelm von Osten in the early 20th century. Von Osten claimed Clever Hans could perform wonders such as arithmetic computation, the telling of time, the tracking of the Gregorian calendar, and reading German, which were all generally confirmed to onlookers by clomping a hoof an appropriate number of times. When investigated, it was found that, in all probability, von Osten was subconsciously cueing Clever Hans. When clomping out the answer to 2 times 4, for example, Clever Hans simply watched his owner and noted when he grew tense, which generally coincided with the correct moment in which to stop his hoofbeats. Amazingly, von Osten was not likely aware of this and was sincere in his belief. For a time, he continuously toured the country to show off the horse's wondrous talents completely free of charge. In a strange, heartwarming way, the case was simply a pet doing whatever it thought would make its owner happy. In the current year, this phenomenon is sometimes known as the Clever Hans effect, and it is a locus of potential problems in experiments involving behavior and learning. The pervasiveness of the effect has been suggested to be quite substantial, and experimental countermeasures are still a topic for scientific discussion. While the SRI went to great lengths to avoid what is essentially the Clever Hans effect, it is hard to see how any experiment involving so many people over so many attempts between so many locations would avoid any contamination. Indeed, the SRI staff was acutely aware of the dangers of inadvertent cueing, hence the desire for the double-blind protocol. Since the experiments were not undertaken in strict laboratory conditions, nor could they have possibly been given the subject matter, it is conceivable the protocols occasionally weakened enough to make a difference. Over the years, United States intelligence services, such as the CIA, distanced themselves from psychic research in general, and remote viewing in particular. Perhaps surprisingly, agency memos don't indicate a harsh or overtly skeptical opinion of the whole subject, so much as a pragmatic one. It seems that remote viewing was looked upon as, though possibly real, simply not useful enough for further sponsorship. Any viewer who seemed genuine in his or her abilities could only muster vague and imprecise images, all of which were exceedingly primitive in quality compared to even something as relatively unsophisticated as a camera mounted beneath an aircraft. A fallacy common to the logic employed by proponents of psychic feats is the tendency to interpret very vague or nebulous information in such a way as to constitute a psychic hit. Ironically, this same interpretive problem also plagues skeptics, as they tend to ignore genuinely intriguing results that are not, nor ever seem to be, specific enough. Skeptic Michael Shermer demonstrated this inherent problem in an admittedly casual experiment undertaken in Sausalito, California, during a layman's seminar on remote viewing given by Dr. Wayne Carr, a licensed psychologist. 2 individuals who had seemed particularly gifted in remote viewing were tasked to find a sealed photograph provided by Mr. Shermer. After at least an hour of intense concentration, the viewers presented their guesses through verbal descriptions and rough sketches they each believed approximated the image on the target. The results included everything from an impression of spinning cylinders to a Ferris wheel, a Chinese wall, rockets, an oil drum, a caisson, a horse-drawn carriage, the crossing of a river, and even the image of Teddy Roosevelt. Before revealing the hidden image, Shermer is quite correct to point out to Dr. Carr the intrinsic vagueness within the guesses. The wide variety of subjects given by the remote viewers could be interpreted in thousands of ways, at least one of which might seem to fit. Furthermore, a vast majority of sketches made by the two viewers consisted of simple geometric shapes and line segments, which could easily be shoehorned into a false mimicry of the target, if one were motivated to do so. The image was of the Hubble Deep Field, which was an obvious miss when compared to the viewer's guesses, despite Dr. Carr's somewhat tortured effort to link the idea of spinning with turning galaxies. However, a flaw in Mr. Schirmer's reasoning becomes apparent once one considers other possible guesses. What if one of the viewers had simply left their paper blank and described a void, or said they felt unbearably cold? What if instead of spinning cylinders, they described hundreds of spirals and ovals, the two most common shapes of galaxies? None of these would require anything more than a simple geometric design, and are nothing close to specificity, especially the blank page, which is infinitely interpretive. Yet to say that these descriptions would not immediately raise the hair on one's neck would be willful ignorance of something obviously strange. Ultimately, the point is not to say skeptics like Schirmer are wrong to distrust weak evidence. They are not. But strong evidence should be based on something other than a personal interpretation. As being human, all sides are biased, and are generally more interested in being right than discovering the objective truth. The world has long been seasoned by an army of charlatans who claim to be psychic. One can hardly find a community anywhere on Earth without a local fortune teller or the equivalent, advertising their special talents as a candle in the dark into which the gullible and desperate eventually crash and burn. But these obvious frauds, many of whom have been subject to quite damning and many would say amusing exposés over the years, do not discredit the entire subject any more than a phantom Nigerian prince discredits all claims to inheritance. Throughout the months of SRI experimentation, Harold Puthoff and Russell Targ encountered a steady stream of criticism from both popular skeptics and the scientific and intelligence communities at large. While much of this, particularly that aimed at the less than rigorous experimental standards, is well-founded, criticism directed at the general validity of paranormal research seems little more than a poor reaction of one group against their more inquisitive peers. Perhaps there never was nor ever will be a bona fide psychic. Perhaps psychic abilities are very rare or very subtle and require more sensitive apparatus than is currently available. Perhaps a psychic individual hasn't been born yet, and we are simply putting the proverbial cart before the horse. It is far too easy in the modern world to become a jaded cynic, a person to whom the wondrous and fantastic no longer astound. This is unfortunate, for the cosmos is a place of infinite wonder that astounds. Puthoff, Targ, and their colleagues at the SRI should at least be given credit as a bulwark against this disease of the human spirit, as they were, at heart, doing the most fundamentally human thing of all, asking a question and seeking an answer.